Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're going to be talking this week and next week about leadership. Here at the Value Creators, we don't really subscribe to the usual theories of business leadership, where a great woman or a great man finds themselves in a situation of being the boss in a firm that's gotten itself into trouble, and that great woman or great man points it in a new direction and leads it up the hill to scale the heights of new success and new achievement. It's not really the way things work. Businesses and markets are complex, evolving systems, and it's the interaction of individuals, none of whom are necessarily leaders, that cause new patterns to emerge and new results to occur. Sometimes those individuals might be the people with the most practical knowledge for the situation at some point in time, but that's momentary. But before we get into business leadership, let's learn from history.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Let's look at the broader scope of leadership beyond business, in politics, in the military, in morality, and philosophy. Historians ask the same question that business people do, but they phrase it like this: does history make great leaders, or do great leaders make history? Today we're going to talk to Professor Moshik Temkin, who's written a book called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints that asks that very question. So he will let us enter the debate via his very original insights, an unmatched depth of scholarship, as we'll see. Let's learn from history before we examine business. Moshik, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our subject today is leadership, and you're an expert in that field. We typically approach leadership from a business standpoint, and there's a significant body of leadership theory in business. But today what we're going to do is benefit from your historian's view of leadership. You teach a class at Harvard on leaders and leadership in history. You've done that for a long, long time. You address the question, do leaders make history or does history make leaders, which is fascinating. In business, we have this idea of complex systems that evolve, but it's not necessarily anything to do with leadership. It's a pattern of interaction that goes way beyond leadership, and maybe leadership has no role at all. So you mentioned that Marx, who was a historian, thought similarly to that. He talks about the forces of history. Let's explore leadership with you, Moshik. And I'd like to ask you, if it's possible to start with, for a definition. How do you define leadership when you start teaching your classes at Harvard?
Well, actually, good question. I do not start with a definition because that is unproductive, in my opinion. It's better to try to arrive at a definition based on historical examples. So I think you actually set that up quite nicely when you talked about leadership in the context of the business world. In fact, if you look around you in bookstores or online and look for books on leadership, let's say you're interested in the topic, overwhelmingly, the kinds of books that one encounters have to do with the business world or with a corporate world, the private sector, often focusing on individuals and their leadership. And there's a kind of smaller market, I would say, of books devoted to historical figures, the Churchills and the Napoleons and the Lincolns and so on. These are often what we used to call in history the great men, right? The great men theory of history. And the other part of this is that leadership is often formulated in a way which has no difference with success. It's really about success and about winning. And that's, I think, another subset of the sort of the business environment. So I approach leadership from a different angle. I think the question, obviously, individuals are important and individual leadership is important in history. There are many cases of this. But we really have to dig deeper to see what makes leaders significant, what makes leaders successful or unsuccessful over time. And in order to really address that question, you have to always look at leaders and leadership in combination with the circumstances in which they operate. the constraints that they face, the crises that they had to overcome, right? The challenges that they had. So that's where that question comes from. Does the leader make history, or does history make leaders? I think there's really two definitions that I would give, but they're not the most important thing, I think, in understanding leadership. The first is that there's a very neutral way of using the word leader. So we use the word leader to define people in authority. A person who happens to be a head of state, a person who happens to be, a CEO of an important company, that sort of thing. It's a person in a position of authority. We talk about leaders that way. But then there's a more meaningful way of defining leadership, which has to do, I think, with transformation. People who create significant change in the world. And the change doesn't have to be a positive change. It can be positive, it can be negative. And sometimes we can debate whether we think a change is positive or negative. And there are cases like that in the book, which I'm sure you'll get to. But that's for me the true definition of leadership. It's the sort of figures who were able to operate within particular circumstances and create meaningful change in the world.
Meaningful change in the sense that it wouldn't have happened exactly that way if they weren't in that leadership position?
Well, the what if questions are always difficult. But yes, there are figures in history. I mean, I'm hesitant to take an extreme position because I don't think that history simply revolves around a certain list of famous people. But there are moments in history. There are crises that happen. There are transformations in which you can identify particular leaders without whom you can certainly say either it would not have happened, or if it did happen, it would have happened differently.
Yep. Well, let's get into some of your, I'm going to call them case studies, Moshik, because that's the language of the business school. And you identify a lot of, as you said, those situations, those circumstances where leadership happens. And the first one we'll talk about is the Japanese behavior in World War II. And there's a specific peak to that in your case study, which is the decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. And that's the one where you said, it's hard to identify any individuals as leaders, and yet that decision was made. And you also refer to the dark, rolling, irresistible tide of history that preceded that. So sort that out for us. A big momentous decision. There was leadership involved somehow, but there's a tide of history behind it.
Well, that line that you alluded to, in which I said that it's hard to identify leadership, I wrote that in the context of trying to understand how a society arrives at a point in which you have the famous or infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, right, December 1941. It's such a pivotal moment, so important because of what we know happened afterwards. So my responsibility as a historian of leadership is to try to see not only who made this decision, but how they even got to that point in the first place. And it's quite fascinating, sort of delving into in this case, Japanese history. It's not my it's not my field of study. But as I kept digging, I saw that contrary to, let's say, Nazi Germany, where you have a Hitler, Japan, which was the other part of the, this kind of, world war on that side, doesn't have any individual per se who is identified with these decisions and these actions and this ideology in the same way. You could talk about the emperor, you could talk about this, this figure here or there, but there's really no one person around which the whole thing revolves. And so for something so momentous to happen, who is responsible for it? So then you start looking at the documents, and you see that they are having discussions about bombing Pearl Harbor, about attacking Pearl Harbor, where it seems to be almost predetermined, right? That they're not even debating whether to do it. They all seem to arrive at this consensus that they should do it. So in order to understand something like that, you have to see an important decision that is taken seemingly without any dominant leader making the decision. The emperor is only a formality because the emperor is putting a check but is not even participating in the discussion and is certainly not giving any orders per se. It's also a long history. You can't understand the attack on Pearl Harbor without understanding Japanese militarism and imperialism stretching back decades. And you can't understand those parts of Japanese history without understanding the larger sort of history of imperialism, of colonialism, of the relationship between Japan and Western powers that forced it to open in the 19th century. And then Japan underwent very profound political, economic, and social reforms from within. And so by the time you get to Pearl Harbor, you're already at the end of a long process. And that's what I call the momentum of history, that you see leaders, and I'm using leaders in a very neutral sense here, who are more really the products of history than making any kind of really serious intervention in history, if you see what I mean. So that's why I found it fascinating. This is the one case, or one of the cases in the book, where rather than looking at a leader influencing history or making a change, I'm actually saying, well, here's a very significant thing that happened in history, and I can't find the leader to assign the decision to or the responsibility for.
Sometimes we think about leadership as making momentous decisions, tough decisions, hard decisions to make, but you use an interesting phrase about that Japanese decision, and you said they made it in the context of no choice. They felt they had no choice. So in that sense, it wasn't a momentous decision. It was a feeling or a sensation that they didn't have any choice. They, as you point out in the book, they knew that the situation would, or the decision would be dire, they'd have horrible consequences for them. They knew that. And yet they went ahead and did it because they had no choice. How is that leadership? How is the no choice situation leadership?
Honestly, I think they did have a choice. I think leaders always have a choice. I think they believed that they had no choice. And that's what I wanted to examine as a historian. How do we, in 2023, look back and say, well, bombing Pearl Harbor, in retrospect, terrible decision, look what it led to, for them at least, versus their perception at the time that it was really the only thing they could do. How do we manage that gap, that dissonance? And so those are the kinds of questions that really intrigued me as a historian of leadership. I remember when I first got interested in this topic, because, we have this perception, in popular culture, if people who are interested in the war in a more cursory way, they assume that all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, these lunatic Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor out of the blue. And there's, the war with the United States begins at that moment. And we know that's not true. But then when you kind of delve into the discussions that they were having, the leadership, the policymakers, the discussion that they were having at the time that they took that decision, you go into it and maybe you assume, well, clearly these people were out of their mind. They were detached from reality. They didn't know what they were getting into. But then you read it and you see, actually, they knew exactly what they were doing. They are very rational discussions about the fact that the United States is a larger country and has more material and human resources. And if we launch the war, we better win it quickly, because otherwise the situation might be difficult. And they talk about how to feed the people and how to keep morale up. These are rational policymaking decisions. So I was very interested to see how you have these kind of rational policymaking leadership discussions in a context that retrospectively we understand to be almost insane. So that's where the no choice concept comes from. These are leaders who found themselves in circumstances where they were unable to look outside of where they were placed in history. So I'll give you an example. The Americans told them before that, you need to get out of China. You invaded and are illegally occupying China. Now, the Americans had no leg to stand on when they were giving lectures about, where to, not to invade and not to occupy and all this stuff, because that had been their behavior as well for many, many years. Still, on its face, it's a perfectly legitimate demand. Japan had invaded and occupied China, which was a sovereign country, was also committing unspeakable atrocities there, and all in the name of an ideology of protecting Asian peoples from Western imperialism. But they believed they had a natural right to be in China. And when they read this demand from the Americans, their reaction is, that's absurd. It's an absurd request. It's a non-starter. Clearly, these Americans are not serious and they mean war. But it's actually not an absurd request, if you think about it. So they clearly had put themselves in an ideological mental framework in which a request to end the illegal occupation of a sovereign country was seen to them as putting them in a situation where they had no choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. But yet they do that rationally. So it's that gap which I found fascinating.
Yeah. So later on, as one of the consequences of that decision, or linked, you'll explain it to me, I think, is the American decision to drop atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And you quoted that as an example of the machine seemed to be making decisions on its own. You're referring to the military-industrial complex, but also the great history of weapons development and so on. So Truman was the president, but the machine seemed to be making the decision. Tell us about the machine.
Yeah. Well, we know that once the United States did enter World War II, it then put into the war effort the totality of all its power, which had been built over many years and which significant material, economic, scientific, technological, and intellectual power that was put into the construction of a war effort, of total war. And when they did that, they created what was by far and is by far the world's largest and most powerful and most destructive war machine. And Japan could not, in the end, hold up to that. That was eventually the end of Japan, at least Imperial Japan. So that's the creation of the machine. And of course, since we all, or most of us, saw Oppenheimer over the summer, we know a little bit about, if we didn't know before, about the Manhattan Project and everything that went into it. But you see simply the finest scientific minds and material resources that the country had at the time put into this effort to build weapons that never existed before and would hopefully never need to be used. Because we also know that Nazi Germany was trying to do the same thing, right? And so there was a race to who would get that bomb first. So by the time Mr. Truman became president, of course, he's in the film, he's played brilliantly in a very short scene by Gary Oldman, who I did not recognize even, he was that good in the role. He's played as a sort of glib about having used the bomb, in almost unthinking about it, just very happy with himself. But we know that when he became president after FDR died, he'd had no idea about the atomic bombs or the program. He was just told that he has this technology, this weaponry to use, and he has to give the official order to drop the atomic bombs. But the bombs had already been developed. He had not been involved in that. The order had been given by the previous president, FDR. But even that was the result of the creation of this war machine, which was in itself the product of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was itself the product of this longer history of geopolitical global conflict between Japan and the United States and between great powers. And so Truman is like a little pinpoint at the very end of a long process. And what choice does he have? Is he really in a position to say no to the use of the atomic bombs? It's almost like the mechanism was so powerful, the momentum of war and the need to end that war, to win the war, was so powerful that Truman is almost like an instrument rather than an important decision maker. Now, that being said, so many people were incinerated, innocent children, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as in other places, as were millions and upon millions during the war entirely on both sides. That, the atomic bombs were like the pinnacle, the end product of a very long process. And that's what I was trying to get at, where I tried to identify leadership in an act like the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is it Truman, who officially gave the order? Was it Roosevelt, who ordered the development of the Manhattan Project? Was it the Curtis LeMay, the commanding officer whose planes had been firebombing Japan and who had the plane who actually dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was it the pilot, maybe? Paul Tibbets Jr., who, if you're a pilot dropping an atomic bomb, you also have agency, right? You are actually flying the plane. You have to make that decision to press the button and drop the bomb. That's meaningful. Was it someone else? So this is a whole mechanism. It's so large and so powerful that sometimes we see leaders in situations where they have too much power, so much power that they cannot control that power. It's actually the power controlling them.
Yeah. So you make a different and very, very fundamental point about that particular decision, and it probably applies to the Japanese in some way too. You said there's a core assumption under all of that never ever gets questioned and yet makes all the difference in those kinds of decisions. And in that case, the core assumption was the war must be won. And we talk about that a lot in business. So what are the core assumptions we sometimes are unconscious about that are guiding our operations? So can you tell us your learning and thinking about those core assumptions?
Well, honestly, it comes from a difficult question. I'm a historian. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a moral philosopher, but I think these are deeply ethical, moral questions. The war needed to be won. It's a war, we consider it rightly so, I think, a war of good versus evil. There's a good side and there's the evil side. And Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were on the evil side. So the war against them needs to be won. But at what price? At what price does it need to be won? So if you say the war needs to be won, and that is the most important thing, how many innocent people are you allowed to kill? I'm being very blunt because these are blunt questions that people had to face. I'm not inventing anything. You have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent children and babies incinerated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and firebombed in other cities. Are those killings justified? Would we personally be able to go in and kill innocent people, children, if we're told that would help win a war? That's not an easy question to answer. We look at it retrospectively and we say, yes, we needed to win the war. But if winning a war becomes the most important thing that overrides every other consideration, then that means that you're basically allowed to do anything. You could potentially kill every single person in Japan. I'm just one man. I'm a relatively simple man. I have no, great answers to these questions. But that's what I was trying to get at. I wanted to understand how leaders get to a situation where they believe, in this case, the Americans, that winning the war is so important and so overriding of everything else that they are willing to do what they did. And those are hard things to get over.
Yeah, very hard. I'm going to ask a slightly different question, Moshik, and that is what we in economics call methodological individualism. So you said we talked about the machine making the decision. We talked about the irresistible tide of history. But you also say people make decisions. Nations don't make decisions. Government don't make decisions. Firms don't make decisions. People make decisions. So can you square that for us a little bit, the machine making the decision versus the individuals?
Well, we can use the example that I just gave. In the end, you're right. Somebody had to give the order. In this case, that somebody had to be Truman. So it's a person making a decision, person in a position of leadership or authority. Let's take even the case of the pilot. The pilot has to make a decision at that moment to drop the bomb. He's not a robot. He's a person, right? And so in the end, the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, yes, there is no one individual that we can identify. Yes, the emperor was not giving specific orders. But in the end, they attacked Pearl Harbor, and there are specific people who made that decision, right? So both of these things are happening at the same time. I think you're right to kind of press me on that because it's a tough question. I wrote that line that you just talked about, people make decisions, because I don't want major events, or especially disastrous events in history, to simply get hidden behind no one taking responsibility. So another example, we haven't talked about that, but let's say the Vietnam War, which I consider to be a disaster from the American leadership standpoint. was also the product of very long-standing, powerful momentum of history. It has to do with the Cold War. It has to do with anti-colonial wars. It has to do with events that preceded the arrival of specific people in power. And yet, specific people had to make decisions to, for example, send troops to Vietnam, then escalate the war, send increasing numbers of troops and increase the firepower. Those are individual decisions made at the highest level that people are responsible for. So history of leadership always has that combination. And I wanted to write about that combination of very powerful forces of history, circumstances, crises, constraints, structures on the one hand, but on the other hand, individuals, sometimes very powerful and significant ones, grappling with those situations and making decisions in those contexts.
Well, in that case, you said that they were particularly weak or bad individuals. You gave them a combination of zealotry, incompetence, stupidity, jingoism, paranoia, and machismo, which is a wonderful sentence. You called it abysmal leadership, a form of leadership that leads to disaster that could have been avoided. There was choice. They made their own decisions and they failed because of their own decisions. So leaders with bad traits can take us to bad places, right?
That I wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fact that that's actually that's also an interesting example for me. And it's also taught a lot in leadership. So the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, in which the war, this is before I was born, but the world could have ended in essence because of this nuclear standoff, insane nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union in Cuba, and also in general, was in the end diffused, right, and avoided because of the wisdom of John F. Kennedy, the American president, and also Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier at the time, and the leadership lessons that we're supposed to take from the Cuban Missile Crisis is look at these two wise leaders who were able to prevent nuclear holocaust, save the world, right? Because they were looking at things coolly and rationally, as opposed to a lot of the other people there. Well, I wanted to understand how leaders arrive at a situation like that in the first place. How do we even get to a situation where in 1962, you have leaders on both sides, the American side and the communist side, who are willing to go to nuclear war because they feel that they have no choice and that they have to win this nuclear war? Think of the insanity. Think of how many people could have died. So that's my put down there. Those words were talking about a lot of the people in those rooms who, when you look at the transcripts, you see that poor John F. Kennedy wasn't a perfect man, but at least he was, smart. He's sitting in the room and he has people telling him, you need to go in and drop an atomic bomb on Cuba. And he, in the end, made the right decision. But I'm left thinking as a historian, wow, there were a lot of people there who were willing to see a lot of people dead. For what reason? Very hard for me to fathom. Maybe, Hunter, that's why I'm not personally made of the right stuff. I'm a very, a mild-mannered historian teaching about these things. Whereas you have these men, in that period, it was only men, sitting in these rooms willing to have hundreds of thousands of people die because of what they think to be the national interest or the geopolitical interest or whatever interest it is beyond me because I feel that is just not worth it.
Yeah. Your core assumption question comes up there. What was their core assumption? I mean, something like it's better to destroy the entire world than succumb to communism.
In the case of the Cold War, they believed that they were in an existential struggle. And I can see that. I mean, in retrospect, it looks a little silly. But in real time, there was great fear. People were living, they had bunkers in nuclear bunkers in every building. And there was people of that generation will tell us and tell young people that people lived in great fear that there would be a nuclear war that would wipe out life on the planet, right? And why? Because of this competition between the West and the East, or however you define it, the American side and the Soviet, later Chinese side. And I'm not saying that means that everybody's the same. I personally have a strong preference for a free society. I believe in democracy. I'm I'm not a totalitarian, but am I willing to kill, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people in order to protect the political system that I consider to be more virtuous, or the economic interests of my country in order to just, it's not how I think. But again, maybe that's why I'm a relatively powerless person, and the people in power think very differently from me.
Let's look at an example of individual leadership in your book, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, that I enjoyed a lot, which was about Margaret Thatcher in the UK. I lived through that when I was there. It seemed like she was reversing history, the history in that sense of the country's drift towards, let's call it socialism or government control. She was, and you say so in the book, she was transformational, and she seemed very much like an individual. I mean, she appointed a government, but she was clearly the single driving force behind it. So is that a great example of individual leadership?
Absolutely. In my opinion, Margaret Thatcher, and please note that this opinion is not, for now, an opinion on her virtues or her flaws. In my opinion, as a historian, Margaret Thatcher is the most significant political leader of her generation, not just in the UK, but in the world. If you look at the world that exists today in 2023, in general, the political economy that we have, the relationship between government and business, the relationship between state and citizens, the relationship even between countries, and in many other ways. The way even as we think about ourselves as actors in the economy, as people in society, she believes that there is no such thing as society, but the way that we live is significantly different compared to before Margaret Thatcher came to power. Now, she's not a dictator. She comes to power in 1979 as prime minister, but she is very transformational. And by transformational, I mean that it's not just the country. I don't know about the country's drift to socialism. I'm not sure 100% I agree with that definition. I would say that there had been, as you know, under what they used to call the post-war consensus in Britain. Right? And the post-war consensus consisted of, this is a particular kind of social order. Things like, the NHS and other forms of social protections having to do with conserving a way of life that had lasted for generations, and particular kinds of economic arrangements. It wasn't the most dynamic economy, and there had been many crises, but Labour and conservative governments in the UK, they differed on things, but they did agree on those very, very basic things, on how society should be arranged, on how people should have their way of life, and the relationship between the state and its citizens and their welfare. Margaret Thatcher rejected that consensus. In that sense, she was a member of the Conservative Party, but she was a very radical person, almost revolutionary. Right? She wanted to overturn that consensus. She found it unacceptable, and she succeeded. Now, she didn't succeed by herself. There were things happening also outside of Great Britain, notably in the United States. So her partner, political and intellectual, was Ronald Reagan, the US president. And there are other leaders at the time, even leaders who called themselves socialists. France had a socialist president at the time, François Mitterrand, who wasn't really a socialist. He was actually moving also in a more neoliberal direction. And the term neoliberal is thrown about quite a bit, but I don't think the term neoliberal really captures the degree of change, because Margaret Thatcher really believed, this was, I think, in essence, her view when she said in an interview in 1987, and she said this in all seriousness, right? I'm taking this slightly out of context, but she said, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Now, she didn't really mean by that people, that there's no such thing as a society, but she meant by that we should think of ourselves primarily as individuals responsible for our own well-being as individuals. We should not look to the state or to others or to social movements or any other kind of organizations for our well-being, but we need to take care of ourselves. And she also believed that any sector of the economy that was not profitable, so of course the coal miners are the best example of this, because this had been a fundamental part of the creation of British industry and British power, but had become obsolete over time. and the coal mining industry was no longer a profitable industry. Now, many people argued, no, these are communities. This is a way of life. This is a deal that we have as part of the post-war consensus that we take care of this sector, through thick and through thin. But for Margaret Thatcher, that was not a possibility because she believed that all of these people need to exit the coal mining sector and become essentially entrepreneurs. That's what she encouraged them to do. Now, on paper, that sounds like a good idea. The problem is that not everybody in the world is meant to be an entrepreneur. Some people are good at it. Some people are not. Some people like to be employees or like to be, working in the way of life, and it's not so simple. So her vision certainly won out. So if you look at certainly the Britain of post-Thatcher, even the Labour Party changed after her, right? Tony Blair was essentially a quasi-Thatcherite prime minister, though he was New Labour. But it's also the way that we think about ourselves. I think she really created a transformation in people's psyches as well as in the political world.
Yeah, and she, there were other parts to that story. Who was leading the forces on the other side, and she identified unions as part of that problem. It wasn't business people who were leading, it was unions, and that she tried to change the structure as well. But your analysis is sound, and it's lasted a long time for that transformation. Let's take one other individual leadership example. You talk about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and as examples of moral leadership, which is a whole different area. I think we're all more familiar with Martin Luther King than Malcolm X, but tell us what you think that reveals to us about leadership, Moshik.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So, the book has, I think, a combination of, three different categories, or I would say levels of leadership. The first is, we could talk about, important individual leaders. So, FDR, Margaret Thatcher, there are other examples of, King David at the beginning of the book. These are, significant individuals with a lot of power at their disposal. They have armies, they have the state, they have, government, they have a lot of ability to create change. Another layer, which I talk about in the book, which is really the complete opposite of that. These are people with absolutely no power. Let's think of a situation where in World War II, the French resistance, underground resistance in World War II, or even other cases in history where you have underground movements against dictators, against ruthless dictators, where the cost of resisting, of leading such a movement is almost certain death, right? And there have been many cases like that in history. So I wanted to see how you lead, not when you're head of state, but when you're actually the state or the leaders, the people in power are trying to destroy you or your people. How do you lead then? That's a completely separate question. So that's a second category. And then there's the kind of middle ground, which is really fascinating. These are people who have some power. They don't have the power of a Mao Zedong or of a Thatcher, but they're not a resistance where they get killed. They're people who have no formal or institutional power necessarily. They're not heads of state. They have no armies, but they have visibility. They have certain kinds of capital. It could be social capital, cultural capital. They might have money. They might have means. They have media. Most importantly, they have a cause. They have a powerful cause that they talk about and lead with eloquence. And they have followers who believe in their message and who are willing to go with them. So Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are the two leaders, different kinds of leaders, in what we call the height of the civil rights movement period in the United States. And so they both kind of come to the fore in the 1950s and become extremely important in the 1960s. They both are assassinated. Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Both of them are only 39 when they're assassinated. So they're frozen in time as sort of young, vigorous, very memorable leaders. And most importantly, they are representing the idea of justice and liberation and equality for their people. In this case, Black Americans. Now, I don't need to talk too much about the history of racist discrimination in the United States and of the civil rights struggle, which is an ongoing struggle, it should be said. It's not over. But I wanted to talk about them as offering two different forms of leadership in this context. So one of them, I think one difference is that Martin Luther King Jr. is committed to his cause and he's willing to work with existing institutions, including the United States government, in order to push for the passing of laws. So, for example, he works with the Johnson administration to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And he makes a lot of partnerships and collaborations with, I would say, mainstream American institutions. It's very important for him that the country live up to what he considers to be its ethos and its promise. As Thomas Jefferson had written in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Well, he wants to make that into a real thing, not just words in the Declaration of Independence, but the way the country actually is and exists for people in his day. Now, on the other hand, you have Malcolm X, who is much more revolutionary, I would say, in that he believes that the way forward for his people, for African Americans, is by rejecting the United States as their home, as it exists. He does not believe that the country has some kind of ideals to live up to, because he sees the very presence of African Americans in the United States as the product of colonialism, slavery, and oppression. There is a fundamental rot for him in the existing country, and he's saying, no, we need to offer a model of separation. First, he calls it separation, and then he calls it liberation, right? Now, he dies, he's killed at a moment of transformation, so it's very hard to pinpoint his ideas because they were changing and they were in flux. But he has a very different vision from Martin Luther King about how to achieve progress, equality, and freedom. But what I think they have in common, and this is very important, although their ideas are different, their personalities are different, their backgrounds are different, their levels of education and their social backgrounds are different, what they have in common is a very collective view of progress. They don't believe in symbolism as a substitute, for example, for material justice and equality. They're not impressed because one person from the oppressed group attains a position of power or becomes rich or famous. They don't believe in individual success as a measure or an indicator of success for the group. They believe that only collective progress, only when you look at the overall situation of everybody, can you then say we have succeeded or we have failed. So I kind of brought them, and maybe this is where, this is more controversial. I brought them into that discussion in a kind of juxtaposition with Mrs. Thatcher, because for me, Mrs. Thatcher's vision is a very individualistic vision in the sense of we rise or fall as individuals, right? So think about those pictures of Mrs. Thatcher and her cabinet, always very striking. It's all, a group of men from the same, they kind of wear the same suit and look similar, and we know they come from the same schools, and they're all surrounding her. And there she is in the middle, the only woman, but she's the boss in her dress and pearls and hairdo. So she'd never felt the need to appoint any other women to her cabinet. In fact, she studiously avoided that. She rejected feminism as a movement, as an ideology. She never felt that she had an obligation to women as such to enter into politics or political life. She saw herself as very individualistic in that sense. Whereas I think the vision offered to us by Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X focuses not on what individuals do or don't do, but on what leaders can do for the collective. And because of what I identify as some of the problems we have, serious problems that we have in the world today that are universal problems, not pertaining just to this country or to this group of people or that group of people, but are really common. I think that while paying respect to Mrs. Thatcher and the transformation that she made, we also need to remember that we're all in this together, that we have problems that face all of us, and that the leadership that we need, if we look back in history, is suggested to us by the kind of leaders who worked for a collective good and not just on the individual good.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can close on your conclusion, Moshik. Do leaders make history, or does history make leaders? In systems thinking in business, we call it path dependency. So you call it the powerful momentum of history, the murderous tide of history. Leaders are carried along by it. In systems thinking, we might get to the point, I certainly do, where we say there is no such thing as leadership. There might be a subjective form of it where people look to the most qualified or the most knowledgeable at any moment in time. It's situational, but leadership doesn't really exist. But I think you might take a different point of view from a historical standpoint. But do we conclude anything? Do leaders make history, or does history make leadership? Or do we just understand that we have to ask ourselves that question?
Well, first, I want to agree with you on something. I think that indeed leadership does not exist in the sense that you were talking about, where, it's like a formula that one learns or techniques that one adopts, or here are 10 things you need to master to become a leader. I just don't think that works that way. In fact, the book shows that leadership is often made by, for example, a crises. It's not that someone just comes in and says, "Hey, I'm a leader, follow me." No, it's that the interaction between, let's say, a crisis situation and a particular figure in that situation, that then significant leadership emerges. So Thatcher is a good example, but an even better one is FDR, who had seemed to many people like a lightweight when he came to the presidency in 1932. But his interaction with crisis proved to be irresistible to the overwhelming majority of the American people. They voted for him 4 times in major landslides, and he was also a transformational leader, just the way how the government acts, and a whole range of top, not to mention World War II that we just talked about before. So I think there is such a thing as leaders. I don't think it's non-existent. I think there is such a thing as leadership. I think we see it. We see cases of it in history. But I'm with you in that I think that we really need to be rigorous about understanding that very often it's about the circumstances, and it's about the history and about the structures in which individual leaders operate in, that makes them significant or insignificant leaders, right? So to answer the question, the real answer is that there is no answer. And the fact that there is no answer is the whole driving point. The answer is that leaders make history and history makes leaders. But I did want to bring in a little bit more of the history makes leaders part. Not because I think it's more true, but because I think there is a huge emphasis in our culture. And you only need to look at go on Amazon, and when you click on my book, look to see what other things they are suggested, right? The algorithm. The algorithm will send you to a whole range of books that are talking about these very significant and important individuals, business or politics, what have you. And that's all good and fine, but I wanted to show a little bit in a deeper way how these leaders interact with history, and to show that history sometimes has the final word about what happens to us. And that while leaders make history, it's very often the history that makes the leaders as well.
Well, Moshik, thank you very much. The book is Warriors, Rebels, and Saints. We'll link to it. Do you have your own website where we can come and learn more about what you teach?
Sure. I have my own website. It's just moshiktemkin.com. The book is available in your local bookstores. If you're in the UK, there's this edition that is coming out. Sorry for plugging it, but there you go. Remember that the holiday season is upon us, and what better gift than the gift of a book about leadership? Your uncle might be interested in it, your father, your mother, your son, sister, brother, friends, and even get a gift for yourself. Why not? Be nice to yourself. Get yourself the book. And most importantly, in all seriousness, I'm always happy to hear from readers, even in a direct way. Don't hesitate, don't be shy if you read and are interested in what I wrote, reach out to me. Probably through the website is best. And just ask me anything, and I try to interact with people who are reading my work, and happy to answer any questions.
Good. Well, we'll certainly point them in that direction. Moshik, thank you very much for today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. This was great.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.